This is my true story. I gave my whole life to my son, my time, my money, my strength. I believed that love would come back to me when I grew old. But one evening, when I asked for dinner, he spat in my food and told me to eat it if I thought I was worth anything. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I just looked at the plate, then at him, and something inside me changed forever. I decided that silence would be my weapon. But before I tell you what I did next, tell me where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe so this story can reach others who've been broken by their own blood. He spent his whole life working for one purpose: to give his son the comfort he never had. From dawn till dusk, his hands moved through dust, grease, and sweat. He worked in factories where machines roared louder than voices, in workshops where every coin was earned through aching bones. He didn't complain. Every drop of sweat felt worth it when he came home to see his boy smiling. That smile was his reward, his reason to keep going. He didn't want luxury. He only wanted his son to grow without hunger, without fear, without the weight that crushed his own youth. When other men his age bought new clothes or shoes, he patched his old ones. When others took holidays, he worked double shifts. He saved every rupee, not for himself, but for his son's education, his marriage, his dreams. He believed that sacrifice was the purest form of love, silent, unseen, and endless. He kept his promises quietly, trusting that one day his son would understand what it took to build a home out of nothing. The house they lived in wasn't large, but it was full of meaning. Every wall carried a story, every piece of furniture a memory. The dining table where they ate together had seen birthdays, laughter, and quiet evenings after long days of work. It had seen the father's hands tremble from exhaustion, but still serve food before taking a bite himself. It had seen the son grow, from a boy who needed help with his homework to a man who once promised he'd never let his father feel alone. Years passed, and the boy became everything the father had hoped: educated, well-dressed, confident. People said he had done well, that the father must be proud, and he was, at first. He believed that everything he endured had been worth it. He believed that the kindness he poured into his child had become part of him. But kindness, when unappreciated, becomes invisible. And soon, the father began to notice the small cracks that formed in that illusion of love. The son started to change slowly. He grew impatient when the old man repeated stories. He sighed when asked for help with simple tasks. The meals that once felt warm now felt cold with silence. Still, the father told himself it was just stress, that life made people tired, not cruel. He continued to love his son the way he always had, quietly and without expectation. He still made tea for him in the mornings, still folded his clothes neatly, still prayed for him every night. The neighbors often saw the old man sitting outside in the evenings, waiting for his son to come home. He would look down the road, a faint smile on his face, holding on to hope that things would get better. Some days, the son didn't come home at all. Some days, he came in late, with loud laughter and the smell of arrogance in the air. The father stayed quiet, not because he was weak, but because he didn't want to lose the last thing he believed in. That family still meant something. He didn't see himself as a burden. He still cleaned, cooked, and managed the little garden behind the house. He still believed he was useful, that his presence mattered. But little by little, the words his son said began to carve into his heart. "You don't understand anything. You're too slow. You make everything harder." Each phrase, each sigh, chipped away at the man who had built his world around love. Still, he kept going, because fathers don't stop being fathers, even when their children stop being sons. His heart told him to endure, to keep the peace, to hope, because hope is the only thing that keeps an old man alive when everything else starts to fade. He remembered the years when his son was little, when he'd rush home from work just to bring him sweets, when they'd sit under the streetlight because power cuts were frequent and he'd tell stories to make the boy laugh, when the son would fall asleep on his lap and the father would stay awake, staring at him, thinking, "My boy will never suffer like I did." That memory was his anchor, the proof that love had once been real. As the years passed, the son's words grew harsher, and the warmth in the house grew colder. But the father didn't let bitterness consume him. He still believed that someday gratitude would return, that someday the boy he raised would remember the man who raised him. He still smiled at him every morning, still offered food with gentle hands, still waited for small kindness that never came. His body grew weaker with age, but his mind stayed sharp. He noticed how his son's friends would come by, laughing loudly, treating the home like their own. The father didn't mind. He was glad the house was full of life again. But even there, he was invisible, a shadow moving in the background, cleaning the plates no one thanked him for. Sometimes, when everyone left, he would sit at the table and stare at the stains on the wood. He'd remember how that same table once felt sacred. Now, it was just another piece of furniture that no one respected. Still, he would wipe it clean, whispering quietly to himself, "It's okay. It's just another day." Because for him, endurance wasn't weakness. It was habit. There were nights when he'd wake up and walk through the empty hall, listening to the creaks of the floorboards. He'd look at old photos, his wife's smile, his son's first birthday, the family that once existed. It all looked like someone else's life. The walls still held echoes of laughter, but he no longer recognized the voice of the boy he'd raised. Even when his health began to fail, he refused to complain. When pain twisted through his joints, he smiled and said it was nothing. He didn't want his son to worry. He didn't want pity. He only wanted respect, that simple, unspoken acknowledgement that a father deserves. But respect, once lost, is hard to find again. And then came the evening that would change everything. He came to the table, tired but smiling. He asked gently for a small, extra portion. It wasn't much, just a little more food, a simple comfort. But instead of kindness, he received cruelty that no father should ever endure. His son, the same boy he once fed with his own hands, spat into the food and pushed it toward him. "Eat it if you're worth it," he sneered. The words, the tone, the act, it all cut deeper than any knife. In that moment, something inside the old man broke quietly. Not his heart, that had broken many times before, but his silence. For the first time, he saw clearly. Years of sacrifice, patience, and love had built nothing but entitlement. He realized that love without respect is slavery, and he was done being a servant in a house he had built. He stood up slowly, not in anger, but in final understanding. He looked at the table, the same one that had carried decades of meals and memories, and knew this was the last time he'd ever sit there. He didn't argue, he didn't curse, he didn't cry. He simply walked away, carrying his pain like armor. Because men like him don't scream when they're hurt. They rebuild in silence. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat near the window, looking at the stars. Somewhere between the ticking of the clock and the cold air slipping through the curtains, he decided. Tomorrow, he wouldn't be the same man. Tomorrow, he would remind his son who truly owned everything, not through rage, but through quiet, irreversible action. He realized then that sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't destruction. It's peace built on justice. The son had spat on his food, but the father would serve him something different. The taste of consequence. And as dawn began to rise, the old man's eyes stayed steady. He had worked his entire life to give. Now he would take back what was his, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Because a man who has been humiliated doesn't always seek blood. Sometimes he seeks balance. And that morning, balance was exactly what he planned to restore. It didn't happen all at once. Cruelty never does. It begins softly, hidden beneath excuses and moods. It slips in through moments that seem harmless, a sharp tone, a mocking laugh, a sigh that lingers too long. That's how it started for him. The son he had raised with patience began to speak with irritation instead of warmth. Small mistakes became reasons for scorn. Forgetting something simple brought sarcasm, not concern. The man who once held his father's hand across streets now rolled his eyes when asked for help. At first, the old man blamed himself. Maybe he was becoming forgetful. Maybe he talked too much. Maybe he expected too much attention from a busy man. He tried to adjust, to shrink his presence so he wouldn't bother anyone. He stopped asking questions, stopped telling stories, stopped reminding his son about the old days. Silence, he thought, might keep the peace. But silence doesn't heal disrespect. It feeds it. Every evening, when the son came home, the air in the house changed. The sound of his shoes on the floor brought tension instead of joy. He would toss his bag, turn on the TV, and speak to his father only when necessary. The kindness that once lived in their home was replaced by impatience. Even the meals, once shared moments of laughter and gratitude, became routine, dull, and heavy. The old man began to notice how small gestures turned into insults. If he dropped something, the son wouldn't help. He would stare, smirk, and say, "You should be more careful." If he coughed too loudly, the son would complain about the noise. If he tried to express affection, the son would flinch, as if love itself were embarrassing. The house that had once been built on family now echoed with distance. The father's friends sometimes visited, old men from the neighborhood who remembered his younger days. They would sit on the porch, drink tea, and speak about how lucky he was to have a successful son. The father would smile politely, never correcting them. What could he say? That success had taken the shape of cruelty? That comfort had grown out of coldness? He didn't have the heart to break the illusion. He let them believe he was proud, even as his heart broke quietly beneath his shirt. His son's cruelty didn't always come in words. Sometimes it came in silence, in the refusal to look him in the eye, in the way he avoided conversation. That silence was worse than shouting. It said, "You don't matter." It said, "You've outlived your purpose." Every time it happened, the old man's chest tightened a little more. But still, he didn't speak, because fathers, especially those who grew up in harder times, believe that patience can fix everything. One evening, when the son had friends over, the old man heard laughter coming from the dining room. He peeked in and realized they were laughing at him, at his slow walk, his worn clothes, the way his hands trembled slightly when holding a cup. His son didn't stop them. He laughed too. That night, for the first time in his life, the father cried alone. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just silent tears that rolled down a face that had weathered storms far greater than this. But no storm cuts like the one that comes from your own blood. He began to notice the change in his son's tone when money was discussed. Whenever bills came, the son would sigh and say, "You should have saved more." The father wanted to say that he had, that every coin had gone into his son's schooling, into this house, into this life. But he stayed quiet. He realized then that some people only see numbers, not the sacrifices behind them. As days passed, the disrespect became routine. It no longer shocked him. It just hurt in a dull, constant way, like a bruise that never fades. He became careful around his son, afraid of saying the wrong thing. He learned to predict his moods, to walk softly through the house. Every father wants to feel safe in his own home, but this father felt like a stranger in his. There were moments when kindness returned, short, sudden bursts that made him hope again. A soft word here, a shared smile there, but it never lasted. The son's mood could shift in seconds, turning affection into insult. And so, the father stopped hoping. He started counting days, not dreams. He found himself speaking less and listening more, listening to the small sounds of the house, the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, the wind brushing against the windows. Those sounds became his comfort. They never mocked him. They never called him names. Some days, when the son left for work, the father would walk into his room, not out of curiosity, but out of nostalgia. He would look at the photographs on the wall, his son as a boy, holding his first trophy, his first school uniform, his first bicycle. Each picture carried a memory of joy, but joy, he realized, had a short memory when it meets arrogance. He often sat on the veranda, watching children play outside. He would smile faintly, remembering his own son running barefoot in the yard, laughing without fear. Back then, he had promised himself that his child would always feel loved. He had kept that promise. But the world had changed, and his love had become something his son no longer respected. Something outdated, like an old photograph no one looks at anymore. There were small things that reminded him of how much he had lost, how much the bond had decayed, the way his son slammed doors, the way he spoke to his mother's photo, not with sorrow, but with indifference. The way he forgot his father's birthday, not because he was busy, but because he didn't care. Each of these small acts became a needle, piercing the same old wound again and again. Still, he endured. He told himself that maybe time would soften his son's heart. Maybe kindness would return. Maybe the boy he raised was still somewhere inside the man who now ignored him. He waited for change, not knowing that sometimes waiting is the slowest way to die inside. Then came the first true crack, the night when everything changed. The son came home irritated, hungry, shouting about work. The father tried to calm him, tried to make conversation, but his words only fueled the fire. The son glared at him, muttered something cruel, and stormed away. That night, the father sat in the kitchen alone, his hands trembling, the dinner untouched. He realized that fear had replaced love. And when fear lives in a house, love cannot. The son's disrespect had grown from words into actions, and the father could feel something worse coming. He could feel it in the air, in the way the boy's eyes no longer held recognition, in the way his footsteps carried dominance instead of warmth. He knew that one day, something irreversible would happen, something that would change them forever. But he didn't know it would happen over something as small, as ordinary, as dinner. That night, the night his son spat in his food, wasn't just a single act of cruelty. It was the result of years of disrespect that had gone unanswered, years of silence mistaken for weakness, years of patience mistaken for stupidity. And when it finally happened, it wasn't just food that hit the floor. It was every memory, every sacrifice, every dream of being loved in return. He didn't sleep that night, because when a father realizes his love has turned into someone else's mockery, there's no peace left in his bones, only resolve, quiet, cold, and certain. That night began like any other, quiet, predictable, and heavy with unspoken tension. The father had spent the day alone, watering the plants, wiping down the furniture, and waiting for his son to return from work. Dinner was his small joy, the only time of day he still felt like part of a family. He cooked carefully, slow, but deliberate, his hands trembling slightly from age, yet still steady enough to prepare a warm meal. Each movement carried a silent prayer. Maybe tonight would be peaceful, maybe tonight his son would sit beside him and talk like before. The smell of curry filled the air, mixed with the faint aroma of rice. He set the table with care, one plate for his son, one for himself, the same as always. He poured water, checked the salt twice, and waited. He didn't know that this dinner, simple as it seemed, would become the last time he'd ever share a meal in that house. When his son finally arrived, he looked irritated before even entering the room. The sound of his shoes scraping against the floor echoed through the silence. He didn't greet his father. He just dropped his phone on the table and sat down, sighing loudly. The old man smiled faintly, ignoring the cold air in the room. He served him a portion, placed the bowl gently in front of him, and whispered a quiet, "Eat before it gets cold." The son picked up his spoon and began to eat mechanically, eyes fixed on his phone screen. The father took small bites, glancing up every few seconds, hoping for a word, any word, to break the wall of silence. When the food was almost gone, the father hesitated before asking softly, "Can I have a little more?" "Just a bit. It tastes good tonight." It was a simple request, made with humility, not demand. But it became the spark that ignited years of hidden cruelty. The son froze, then slammed his spoon down. The sound startled the old man, who instinctively pulled back. In the next moment, anger exploded, raw, sharp, and unfiltered. The son grabbed the plate, looked at his father with disgust, and spat into it. The motion was quick, but deliberate. Then, with a tone dripping in hatred, he muttered, "Dogs eat here, not you." The old man didn't move. He didn't even blink. For a moment, the world stopped. The fan above them hummed slowly. The TV in the other room played faint music, but all of it blurred into noise. The only thing that existed was that plate, that small, cruel gesture that shattered a lifetime of love. The smell of food, once comforting, now felt nauseating. His throat tightened as shame and disbelief fought for space in his chest. He looked at his son, the same boy he once carried on his shoulders, the same child he taught to eat with his hands, and he didn't recognize him anymore. That man sitting in front of him wasn't his son. He was a stranger wearing the face of someone he had loved too much. For a long time, neither spoke. The son stood there, still seething, waiting for a reaction, maybe an apology, maybe a plea, but none came. The father didn't shout. He didn't curse. He just stood up slowly, his frail frame straightening with a dignity that words couldn't express. He looked at the mess on the floor, the food, the plate, the insult, and simply said nothing. His silence was louder than any scream could have been. He walked away from the table quietly, each step heavy with memories. Every corner of the house seemed to whisper reminders of love. The couch they sat on together, the pictures on the wall, the marks on the floor from his son's childhood toys. It all hurt now. Those were not memories anymore. They were ghosts of what had been lost. When he reached his room, he closed the door softly behind him. He sat on the edge of his bed, his hands trembling, his stomach empty, but his heart heavier than it had ever been. He didn't cry. His eyes were dry, but his soul wept in silence. It wasn't just about the food. It was about everything that moment represented. The death of respect, the death of family, the death of meaning. He looked at his hands, the same hands that once worked without rest, that built the house, that wrote checks for school fees, that carried groceries, that wiped tears. Those hands had given everything. Now they sat still, powerless. He whispered quietly to himself, not words of anger, but of realization. Something inside him shifted. It was the moment he understood that he could not live like this anymore. The night grew long. Outside, the moonlight filtered through the window, soft and cold. The father sat awake, replaying every moment that had led to this. He remembered the first time his son had called him useless. He remembered the looks of disgust when he made small mistakes. He remembered every sigh, every complaint, every time his son spoke as if love were a burden. And now, this final insult, had burned away whatever hope was left. He didn't want revenge. What he wanted was peace, the kind that comes when you finally stop expecting kindness from cruel people. But peace sometimes comes disguised as action. That night, as the clock ticked toward dawn, he began to think not with emotion, but with clarity. For the first time in years, his thoughts felt sharp. The pain had given him focus. He looked around his room, the old wooden wardrobe, the framed photographs, the files stacked neatly on the desk. Among them were documents he hadn't touched in years, property papers, bank statements, legal certificates. He smiled faintly. Everything still had his name on it. Every wall in that house, every piece of land, every asset, all of it belonged to him. Not his son, him. The man who had been spat on still owned everything. That thought didn't bring pride. It brought power. Quiet, righteous power. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he planned. Not in anger, but in purpose. He knew he would never raise his hand or voice against his son. But he would make sure that the boy who spat in his food would learn that respect, once lost, cannot be bought back. Not with money, not with tears. When morning arrived, the house was still. The son slept soundly, unaware that his life was about to change forever. The father stood by the window, watching the sunlight spill into the garden. He felt no hatred, no rage, only calm determination. He decided that the next time his son would sit at that table, there would be no meal, no comfort, no safety, only the taste of his own arrogance. He went to the kitchen, looked at the plate still lying on the floor, and picked it up. He washed it slowly, carefully, as if purifying not just the dish, but his own spirit. When he was done, he placed it upside down on the counter, a symbol, a quiet farewell to the life he once knew. That day, the old man ate nothing. Hunger didn't matter anymore. He had fed everyone else his whole life. Now, he would feed his purpose. He knew that revenge wasn't about hurting someone back. It was about restoring balance, and by the time the sun set again, balance would begin to return. Because that dinner, that small, cruel moment, had written a new chapter in his life. A chapter not of weakness, but of quiet justice. And when he closed his eyes that night, for the first time in many years, he didn't pray for forgiveness. He prayed for strength. That night was the longest night of his life. The house was silent, but the silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like the air before a storm. The walls seemed to listen. The floorboards groaned softly, as if they too carried the weight of everything left unsaid. He sat at the corner of his bed, staring at the same pair of shoes he'd worn every day for years, his hands resting motionless on his knees. The world outside moved as usual. Dogs barked, wind rustled through the trees, distant laughter echoed from neighbors' homes, but none of it reached him. Inside that small room, time stopped. The humiliation still burned, not in his skin, but in his soul. His stomach had long since stopped aching from hunger, but his heart still twisted at the memory of that plate on the floor. The food, the spit, the insult. He had never thought a day would come when his own child would make him feel lower than the dust beneath his feet. It wasn't about anger anymore. Anger was sharp and loud. This was different. This was quiet, cold, and deep. He remembered when that same son was a child, sitting in the same kitchen, eating from that same plate with clumsy hands. Back then, he would laugh when rice spilled or soup dripped. The father would wipe his chin, kiss his forehead, and tell him he was proud. That was love, patient, gentle, unconditional. Now, that same love had been thrown to the floor, spat on, and crushed under the shoes of arrogance. He didn't move for hours. The moonlight crept slowly across the floor, then retreated, leaving the room dark. His body felt heavy, but his mind was painfully awake. He tried to understand. Where did it all go wrong? When did love turn into resentment? When did gratitude rot into entitlement? He thought of all the sacrifices he had made, the nights he went hungry, the days he worked in pain, the years he gave away without asking for anything in return. He thought of every choice that had built his son's comfort. Every drop of sweat had become someone else's pride, and now that same pride had turned into cruelty. But even through all that pain, a strange calm began to grow. It wasn't the calm of surrender. It was the calm of understanding. He realized something that night. Silence wasn't his weakness. It was his weapon. All his life, he had fought with patience. Now, he would fight with silence and strategy. He wouldn't argue, he wouldn't beg, and he wouldn't shout. He would act. He stood up slowly and walked toward the small wooden cupboard in the corner of his room. Inside it were stacks of old files, bank papers, property documents, insurance records, things he hadn't touched in years. He pulled them out one by one, his old hands steady despite the tremor in his heart. The papers smelled faintly of dust and age, but they also smelled of something else: control. He realized that while his son had mocked him, insulted him, and spat on his dignity, the real power still rested in his name, written in ink on every single sheet. He smiled faintly for the first time that night, not out of joy, but out of awareness. The son thought he had broken him. The son thought the old man was helpless. But helplessness is an illusion, one that ends the moment you remember who you are, and that night he remembered. He carefully folded the documents back into the cupboard. There was no need to rush. Revenge built in anger burns too fast. But revenge built in silence lasts forever. He decided he would sleep, not to rest, but to plan. Tomorrow, the world would look the same, but the ground beneath it would start to move. He lay down on the bed, staring at the ceiling. The fan spun slowly above him, making a faint rhythmic sound that reminded him of factory machines from his younger days. Back then, he worked long hours, dreaming of the life his son would have, a life better than his own. He had built that dream with everything he had, never imagining that one day it would turn into his greatest punishment. As he drifted between wakefulness and exhaustion, he thought about his wife. She had passed away years ago, leaving behind a heartbroken husband and a son too young to understand loss. If she had been alive, she would never have allowed things to reach this point. She had been gentle but strong, the bridge that kept their family together. He could almost hear her voice now, calm, comforting, reminding him to stand tall, to keep his dignity even when surrounded by cruelty. The memory of her gave him strength. It reminded him that he wasn't doing this out of spite. He was doing it out of self-respect. There's a difference between revenge and justice, and he had chosen justice. His son needed to learn that cruelty has a cost, and that cost would be paid not through violence, but through consequence. When morning came, he didn't rush. He moved slowly, with purpose. He made his bed neatly, washed his face, and looked into the mirror. The man staring back at him was old, yes, his hair white, his eyes tired, but behind those eyes was something new, determination. His wrinkles weren't signs of weakness anymore. They were reminders of survival. He brewed tea and sat by the window as the sun began to rise. The world outside looked peaceful. Children walking to school, birds chirping, neighbors sweeping their porches. Life went on as if nothing had happened, but inside him, everything had changed. The humiliation had burned away his hesitation. He wasn't afraid anymore, not of loneliness, not of losing his son, not of starting over. He had already lost what mattered most: respect. Now, he had nothing left to lose, and that gave him freedom. He thought about confronting his son, about shouting, demanding an apology. But then he stopped. Apologies from people without remorse are just empty words. He didn't need his son's apology. He needed his peace. And peace doesn't come from arguing. It comes from ending what breaks you. So, as the day began, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would end the cycle of disrespect, not with shouting or bitterness, but with quiet, irreversible action. His son would wake up to a world that looked the same, but felt completely different. He finished his tea, cleaned the cup, and placed it upside down on the counter, the same way he had done with the plate the night before. It was symbolic now, a way of saying, "This chapter is over." He walked to the cupboard again, took out the papers, and placed them in a neat pile on the table. Each sheet represented a piece of power his son didn't know existed: savings, property deeds, accounts, all in his name, all still his. That night of silence had given him clarity. It had stripped away the pain and replaced it with purpose. He wasn't just going to walk away. He was going to walk away free. Free from insult, free from dependency, free from the illusion that blood guarantees love. When his son finally woke up that morning, the father was already gone from the house, but his presence lingered everywhere. The locks were changed. The documents were gone. The old man's slippers were missing from the doorstep. And on the dining table, where last night's cruelty had unfolded, there was only one thing left: a folded napkin, clean and untouched, with a small note written in careful handwriting. "Respect is the only food that fills the soul. You took that away. Now, eat what you've made." That note wasn't angry. It wasn't cruel. It was calm. And that calmness was what made it so powerful. That night, as the father rested in a quiet guest house miles away, he felt no regret. The silence that had once felt suffocating now felt sacred. It wasn't the silence of fear anymore. It was the silence of peace. Because sometimes, the most powerful sound in the world isn't the slap of a hand or the crack of a shout. It's the quiet closing of a door by someone who has finally had enough. Morning light crept through the curtains like a quiet visitor. The air felt different that day, lighter, colder, but clear. The old man woke before dawn, his body moving out of habit rather than rest. He had hardly slept, yet he felt no exhaustion. What filled him now wasn't fatigue or sadness. It was certainty. The night had taken everything from him: the illusion of love, the last thread of patience. But it had given him something far more valuable in return: purpose. He moved slowly, folding his blanket with care, straightening the pillow, brushing the dust off the edge of his bed. He wasn't doing it out of routine. He was doing it because this would be the last morning he'd ever see this room again. The last morning he'd breathe under this roof. The last morning he'd look at walls that had heard both laughter and cruelty. He didn't cry. Tears are for confusion, and he was no longer confused. On the small table beside his bed lay the stack of documents he had pulled out the night before, his proof of power, his quiet weapon. Each page bore his name, written clearly, permanently. The house, the savings, the land, all still his. For years, he had believed that giving his son control would make life easier. He'd thought that age meant surrender, but that was a lie. One society teaches the old to make them quiet. That morning, he decided he would not be quiet anymore. He took the papers and sat by the window. The early sun cast soft gold on the table. He looked at his reflection in the glass. Tired eyes, lines of pain carved deep, but behind them, something unbreakable. That reflection wasn't of a victim. It was of a man who had been patient long enough. He poured himself a small cup of tea, hands steady. Every sip was a promise that he would reclaim the respect that had been spat on. He wasn't going to scream or destroy, number. He would simply remove himself and everything his son took for granted from that world of arrogance. He dressed carefully, wearing his old brown coat, the one his wife used to say made him look dignified. He folded the documents neatly into a worn leather bag, tied it closed with a piece of cloth, and stood up. The house was quiet. His son still slept soundly in the next room, unaware that the man he thought powerless was already rewriting the future. He walked through the hallway, his steps soft on the tiled floor. He paused at the family photos on the wall, snapshots from a life that no longer existed. There was one picture of his son as a little boy, laughing while holding his father's finger, his small hand gripping with trust. The old man touched that photo gently, his thumb tracing the boy's face. That was the child he loved. The man sleeping in the other room. That was someone else. He whispered a silent goodbye, not for his son, but for himself, for the man who had once believed too deeply, forgiven too easily, and endured too long. Then he walked out the front door, leaving behind the home that was no longer his refuge. The streets were quiet. He walked slowly, feeling the crisp air against his skin. Each step was a small act of liberation. The morning sky was pale blue, the kind that makes everything feel possible again. He reached the main road and waved down a passing rickshaw. The driver greeted him kindly, asked where he wanted to go. The old man simply said, "To my lawyer's office." The ride was long, but he didn't mind. The city moved around him, shops opening, children running to school, people rushing to work, all unaware that an old man was on his way to reclaim his life. As the rickshaw rolled forward, he thought about how strange life was. You raise someone, give them everything, and one day they forget who you are. But destiny always remembers. When he arrived, the lawyer greeted him with surprise. "You're up early today, sir," he said politely. The father smiled faintly and handed him the documents. "I want to make some changes," he said simply. His voice was steady, calm, the kind of calm that comes only when a decision is already made. They sat together for hours, reviewing every paper. The old man's eyes didn't waver once. He signed each form carefully, ensuring every line was in place. The lawyer asked a few questions. Was he sure? Was this permanent? Did he want to think about it longer? The father only shook his head. "No," he said. "I've already thought long enough." By noon, everything was done. The ownership of the house was prepared for sale. The bank accounts were to be transferred to a private trust under his own control. His son's name, once added for convenience, was now removed entirely. Every signature was a silent strike, not of anger, but of justice. As he stood up to leave, the lawyer looked at him with quiet admiration. "You're a strong man," he said. The old man smiled gently and replied, "I'm just a man who's learned that silence can build empires, and end them too." He walked out of the office lighter than he had felt in years. The world seemed brighter, the air cleaner. For the first time in a long while, He didn't feel like a burden. He felt like himself again. On his way home, he stopped at a small bakery, a place he hadn't visited since his wife passed away. He bought a single piece of sweet bread and sat on a bench outside, eating it slowly. The taste brought back memories of simpler times, of family dinners where laughter came easily. It didn't make him sad. It reminded him that life had once been kind, and that kindness could return if he allowed it to. When he reached home, the sun was beginning to set. The light poured through the windows in long golden rays. His son wasn't there, probably out with friends, living the life he thought would never end. The father walked through each room, quietly checking that everything was in order. He didn't take much, just his clothes, the photo of his wife, a few keepsakes, and the leather bag with his documents. Before leaving, he walked back to the dining table, the same one where his son had spat in his food. The memory still hurt, but it no longer controlled him. He stood there for a long moment, then picked up the empty plate and washed it once more. He dried it carefully and placed it on the shelf, not out of duty, but out of closure. He looked around the house one last time, the walls, the furniture, the memories. Every corner carried echoes of laughter that no longer belonged to him. Then, with a slow, deep breath, he turned off the lights and stepped outside. The evening breeze brushed against his face as he locked the gate. He didn't look back. Some goodbyes don't need words. They need silence. That night, as he stayed in a small inn near the outskirts of the city, he felt an unfamiliar feeling. Peace. For the first time in years, no one shouted at him. No one mocked his age. No one made him feel small. He sat by the window, watching the moon climb high into the night sky, and whispered softly to himself, "It's over." But it wasn't revenge that gave him peace. It was release. He had carried pain for too long. Letting it go wasn't weakness. It was wisdom. The next morning, his lawyer called to confirm that the sale process had begun. The house, the same house his son had called his own, was no longer in his control. Within days, the ownership would shift completely. His son wouldn't even realize until it was too late. The accounts, too, were frozen and redirected. Every form of power his son had used to control him was gone. The father didn't celebrate. He didn't boast. He simply smiled and poured himself another cup of tea. It tasted better than it had in years, maybe because it was made with freedom. In his heart, he didn't wish suffering upon his son. He only wished understanding, the kind that comes when life humbles you. He knew that when the time came, when the son would see the empty house and the frozen bank account, he would finally understand the weight of his own cruelty. And when that happened, the old man wouldn't be there to see it. Because by then, he would already be gone, far away, living a quiet life somewhere peace doesn't need to be begged for. The decision was made. The plan was in motion. The story had changed forever. He had spent a lifetime giving. Now, for once, he had taken something back. His dignity. The next morning arrived quietly, wrapped in the stillness of a new beginning. The old man woke early, long before the world outside began to stir. The air was cool, the kind that felt like it was cleaning the past out of his lungs. The decision had already been made. Now it was time to set everything in motion. But there was no rush, no panic, no noise. He moved with calm precision, as if each step had been rehearsed in his mind long before it began. He walked to the small table by the window, where his cup of tea waited beside the neat pile of papers. He looked out into the morning fog that hung low over the street, the same street he had walked for decades, to work, to buy groceries, to visit the neighbors. It felt different today. It wasn't home anymore. It was just a road leading away from something he had already outgrown. He took a slow sip of tea, the steam brushing against his wrinkled face. Every taste reminded him that this might be the last morning he'd ever drink tea in this house. But instead of sadness, he felt peace. People think leaving hurts the most, but sometimes staying hurts even more. When the sun began to rise, he gathered his things. He folded the important papers into his leather bag, adjusted the strap across his shoulder, and put on his old pair of shoes, the same ones he had worn for years, patched but sturdy. He moved through the house one last time, like a quiet ghost. Each room carried the echo of a memory, laughter from the past, arguments from the present, silence from the night before. He stopped in the living room where the furniture still stood neatly in place. His eyes wandered to the corner where his son once played as a child, building towers out of wooden blocks. He could still remember those giggles, the way the boy would run to him proudly to show what he built. He smiled faintly, remembering the innocence that used to fill this home. But then his smile faded, replaced by the shadow of what that same boy had become, a man poisoned by pride and greed. The kitchen came next. He walked slowly to the table where the humiliation had happened. The plate that once held the insult, the food spat on by his own son, was now washed and stacked on the shelf. He had cleaned it the night before, not for anyone else, but for himself. It was his way of cleansing the memory, of saying that no bitterness could live in a clean heart. He stood there for a moment, hands resting on the back of the chair, and whispered a quiet thought in his mind, not of revenge, but of release. Then, like a man completing a ritual, he began locking every cupboard, every drawer, every storage space in the house. The keys jingled softly in his hand as he went from room to room. The sound was steady, rhythmic, like a calm drumbeat marking the start of something new. He wasn't doing it out of anger. He was doing it because he wanted his son to feel what it meant to have everything but own nothing. He locked the pantry where the rice and grains were stored. He locked the fridge, the cupboards, the utility boxes, even the small storage under the stairs where old supplies were kept, locked. Each turn of the key was deliberate, final. When he was done, he stood in the center of the house and looked around. The place looked the same, but something had changed. It was no longer a home. It was a shell waiting to teach a lesson. Afterward, he sat down and pulled out the set of keys from his pocket, the main house key, the car key, the locker key, and began separating them carefully. Some he kept. The rest he placed into an envelope. On the front, in neat handwriting, he wrote his lawyer's name. That envelope represented the transfer, the shift of control, the quiet power he now held. When everything was prepared, he called his lawyer once more. The man on the other end greeted him respectfully. The father spoke with clarity. "It's time. Finalize everything today." His tone was calm, almost gentle, but it carried the weight of authority that comes only from someone who has been broken and rebuilt in silence. The lawyer assured him everything would proceed as planned. The sale would go through, the accounts would be secured, the ownership finalized. The old man thanked him, hung up, and then sat in silence. Outside, he could hear birds beginning to sing. The world continued, unaware of the quiet revolution taking place in that one small home. Around mid-morning, the son returned home, unaware that the foundations of his life were already shifting beneath him. He entered with his usual arrogance, kicking off his shoes and tossing his bag onto the sofa. He didn't notice the locked cupboards at first. He didn't notice the quietness that filled the house. He called out once, expecting the usual greeting. None came. He frowned, but brushed it off, assuming his father had gone for a walk. He went to the kitchen to grab something to eat. That's when he noticed. The cupboards wouldn't open. The refrigerator wouldn't budge. Every drawer, every shelf, locked. Confusion turned to irritation. He yanked harder, slammed a few doors, cursed under his breath. Then he noticed the keys were missing from their usual hook. His face tightened. He stomped through the house, calling louder now. Still, silence. The father was gone. He checked his father's room, empty. The bed was made neatly, the wardrobe open, but half empty. On the bedside table lay only a small folded note that said, "When respect is gone, comfort follows." That one sentence hit harder than any shout could have. The son stood there for a while, feeling a strange sense of unease crawl through his chest. He stormed back to the kitchen, pacing. Anger began to rise again, but behind it, something colder. Fear. Meanwhile, miles away, the father sat in a small cafe, sipping tea, while the lawyer's assistant called to confirm the transfer papers had been received. His voice was steady, his hands relaxed. Everything was falling into place. The house was listed, the buyer was ready, and the funds were moving into secure accounts under his name only. His son wouldn't know until it was too late. He didn't smile. This wasn't joy. This was justice. Slow, quiet, deliberate. He didn't want to destroy his son. He wanted to wake him up. Sometimes pain teaches what comfort never could. By afternoon, the sun had shifted high in the sky. The father walked through the market nearby, buying a few essentials for his new life, some clothes, a few groceries, a small notebook. He planned to leave the city within a few days, move to a quieter town where nobody knew his name or his story. He would start again, not as someone's father, but as himself. Back at the house, the son began to realize something was wrong. His father's phone number was disconnected. His contacts weren't answering, and then, when he finally checked his bank account to withdraw money, it was empty. The balance that had always been there, the one he thought of as his own, was gone. Frozen, redirected, controlled. He sat on the couch, phone trembling in his hand, as reality began to sink in. For the first time, the house felt too quiet, too empty, too cold. The arrogance drained out of him like color from a photograph. That night, the father didn't sleep in a bed of guilt or regret. He slept peacefully, knowing that the lesson had begun. He had not raised his hand. He had not shouted. He had not cursed. But he had reclaimed everything, his dignity, his peace, his control. And perhaps one day, when his son sat in that same locked kitchen, hungry and confused, staring at the floor where he once humiliated his father, he would finally understand the meaning of that silence. Because sometimes, the greatest revenge isn't about taking what someone loves. It's about showing them what life feels like without what they took for granted. That night, the father whispered to himself before drifting off to sleep. He said, "Dogs eat here, not you." Now, he will know what hunger truly tastes like. And with that final thought, he closed his eyes. The plan was done. The setup complete. Tomorrow would begin the reckoning. Evening arrived like an echo. Soft at first, then sharp as realization sank in. The son returned home late, still frustrated from the morning. He had tried calling his father several times, but the phone stayed switched off. He had driven around town, visited familiar spots, asked a few neighbors, but nobody knew where the old man had gone. Every road led him back to the same locked gate, the same cold walls that no longer felt like home. He entered the house and tossed his bag aside, irritation clouding his face. He muttered to himself, trying to convince his own guilt that everything would be fine, that the old man would return, that nothing serious had happened. But as he walked through each room, the silence grew heavier. The cupboards were still locked, the keys still missing, and the absence of that familiar presence, his father's slow steps, his quiet voice, made the air in the house feel strange. He sat down at the dining table and stared at the empty space before him. The memory of that night, the one where he spat into his father's food, replayed again and again, this time without pride. It had seemed funny then, a moment of cruel power he thought would never matter. But now, in the quiet of his own making, it wasn't funny. It was haunting. The table where laughter once echoed now stood as a monument of shame. Hunger began to crawl into his stomach. He walked to the kitchen, rattled the locks again, even tried to pry one open with a spoon. It didn't budge. He kicked the fridge door in anger, shouted curses into the emptiness. But the emptiness didn't answer back. It just stared at him, cold, still, unbroken. By midnight, he gave up trying. He searched for his wallet, hoping to order food, but when he checked his bank app, his heart froze. The screen showed a blank balance. His account, which had always held more than enough, was now empty. The numbers were gone, erased like chalk from a board. He sat there staring at it, refreshing the page again and again, thinking it must be a mistake. But it wasn't. Panic crept up his spine. He called the bank, only to hear a polite voice tell him that the account had been legally restructured under new ownership authorization. He didn't understand, or rather, he didn't want to understand. His father had done it. The old man who he thought was weak, helpless, and senile. That same man had moved silently behind the curtain and taken everything back. He sank into the couch, his hands trembling. For the first time in his life, he felt powerless. All the control, all the arrogance, all the mockery, gone. He thought of his father's quiet eyes that night, the way he didn't argue, didn't shout. He remembered the silence that followed his insult. That silence had been heavy, yes, but now he understood why. It wasn't defeat, it was strategy. He spent that night pacing the floor, mind racing. He didn't sleep. Every tick of the clock reminded him of the words he once threw so easily. "Dogs eat here, not you." Those words that once made him feel powerful now rang like a curse inside his skull. Because now, he was the one hungry. He was the one alone. He was the one sitting before an empty plate. The next morning, hunger gnawed at him again. He searched the house desperately for something to eat. In the corner of the kitchen, he found a small loaf of stale bread, dry and cold. He didn't hesitate. He broke it apart with his hands and began to eat on the floor, just like the man he once insulted. The crumbs fell beside him as he chewed quietly, his throat tight. And as he sat there, the weight of irony crushed him completely. The floor that he once pointed to in cruelty had become his own table. That was the moment he broke. Pride is a fragile thing. It looks powerful until hunger, silence, and truth touch it. Then it crumbles like ash. He leaned his head against the wall and wept, not loudly, but with the quiet of someone who finally understood the cost of his actions. Tears fell onto the cold tiles as his chest tightened with guilt. Each tear carried a memory. The nights his father carried him home from school, the hands that once fed him, the love he had taken for granted. Every memory that once felt distant now returned like a wound reopening. By evening, his mind was spinning. He needed answers, needed to find his father. He went to neighbors, to relatives, to anyone who might know something. Some looked at him with pity. Others looked with quiet judgment. Everyone had heard what had happened. The sale, the money, the humiliation he once caused now whispered back through the streets. He had become the story people told behind closed doors. Not the proud son, but the man who lost everything because of his own cruelty. Days passed. He couldn't find his father. Each morning, he woke to the same silence, the same locked doors, the same emptiness. The food ran out. The lights flickered off when the unpaid bills caught up. The house, once filled with luxury, began to feel like a cage. His friends stopped visiting. His phone calls went unanswered. And in that isolation, he met his real self, the man he had built from pride and disrespect. One afternoon, he sat by the window, staring out at the street. Children ran past laughing, their voices light and free. He remembered how his father used to stand at that same window, smiling at the neighborhood kids, waving as they passed by. The memory struck deep, not because it was painful, but because it reminded him of the man he had turned away from, the man who had done nothing but love him. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of gold, he found the courage to open his father's old room. The air smelled faintly of sandalwood and dust. Everything was neatly arranged, just as his father had left it. He walked slowly around the room, touching the small things, the books, the framed photo of his mother, the half-burnt candle on the table. Then he noticed something under the pillow, a small piece of folded paper. With shaking hands, he opened it. Inside was a short note written in his father's handwriting. "When kindness leaves a home, the walls remember it. One day, so will you." He sat on the bed holding that note for a long time. No words, no excuses, no tears could erase what he had done. The walls that once echoed his laughter now whispered the truth back to him. That night, he slept in his father's bed for the first time in years. He didn't dream. His sleep was heavy, the kind that comes not from peace, but from exhaustion of guilt. Meanwhile, far away, the father sat by the window of his small rented room in another town. The world outside was peaceful. Children playing, the smell of food from nearby kitchens, the hum of life continuing without noise. He sipped his tea and looked up at the night sky. Somewhere, he knew his son was learning, not through lectures, not through punishment, but through life itself. He didn't hate his son. Hate takes energy, and he had none left for that. What he felt instead was release. He had given his lesson, a quiet, irreversible lesson, written not in words, but in consequences. As the days turned into weeks, the son's arrogance melted completely. He tried to contact his father again, letters, phone calls, messages, but there was no response. The old man had vanished, leaving behind nothing but silence and a truth too powerful to escape. One morning, the son stood outside the house as the new owners arrived. The papers had finalized. The home was no longer his. He watched as strangers walked in, as if he were an outsider on his own doorstep. The weight of that sight broke whatever pride was left in him. He turned away, shoulders slumped, hands empty. In that moment, he finally understood his father's silence. It wasn't weakness. It was strength. The kind of strength that doesn't scream, but changes everything quietly. He walked down the same road his father once took, but now each step felt heavier. The town looked the same, yet nothing was familiar anymore. Because when you lose respect, even home stops recognizing you. That night, as he lay on a stranger's couch, his mind returned to that one meal, that one insult, that one cruel laugh. He would never forget it. It would follow him everywhere, not as punishment from his father, but as the echo of his own making, and far away, the father slept peacefully. Justice had been served, not by law, not by anger, but by truth. Because in this life, what you feed others always finds its way back to your own plate. Morning came with no warmth, no welcome. The house that once stood proud now felt hollow. Its walls no longer carried laughter, only the echo of loss. The son woke to that emptiness, the kind that no amount of noise could fill. The floor beneath him was cold, and his heart carried a weight that pressed harder with every breath. The documents had arrived the previous night, official, stamped, undeniable. The home he believed would always be his was no longer his at all. He sat on the couch, surrounded by papers, notices, transfer documents, legal receipts. His name wasn't on a single one. The signature that had once been his pride, his father's, had now turned into a symbol of power he no longer held. He read the pages again and again, hoping for a loophole, a mistake, a word he could twist into hope. But there was none. It was final, and so was the silence that followed. For years, he had thought authority came from ownership, the house, the money, the control. But now he sat in the center of that house as nothing more than a guest, unwanted and temporary. He looked around at the furniture, the photographs, the memories. Each one mocked him quietly, whispering of a time when he could have chosen respect instead of pride. He walked to the kitchen, but even there the air felt foreign. The cupboards were still locked, the fridge was still empty. The room smelled of nothing, not spices, not warmth, not love. It was a hollow box, and he realized that was exactly what he had turned his father's heart into. As the day stretched on, people began to arrive, not friends, not family, but strangers. The new owners came with calm politeness, holding keys and papers, speaking with voices that felt too soft for such a sharp reality. They weren't cruel, they were just the next chapter, the one he had written for himself without knowing. They walked through the house, inspecting rooms, taking notes, talking quietly. He watched them from the corner, his body still but his soul trembling. Every footstep on the floorboards felt like thunder. Every word they exchanged reminded him that this house, his childhood, his legacy, all of it was gone. When one of them turned and asked, "You're the previous resident?" he could only nod. His throat refused to form words. He didn't correct them, didn't explain, didn't defend. Because deep down, he knew. This wasn't injustice. It was consequence. By evening, the transfer was complete. The locks were changed. His access revoked. He packed his belongings in a single bag. Clothes, documents, a few personal things. Everything else was left behind. As he zipped the bag shut, his eyes caught the photo frame lying on the table. It was old, a picture of his father holding him as a baby. He stared at it for a long time, unable to look away. His father's face in the picture looked younger, warmer, full of hope. That same hope he had crushed one insult at a time. He slipped the photo into his pocket and left the house without a word. The street outside was quiet. A few neighbors stood watching from a distance, their eyes filled with silent judgment. None of them spoke, but he could feel the weight of their thoughts pressing down on him. Everyone knew. As he walked away, the house behind him seemed to shrink, not in size, but in meaning. It wasn't his anymore. It wasn't even home. It was a monument to what pride destroys: love, respect, family, everything that matters. Days turned into weeks. The son moved from place to place, staying with acquaintances, then friends, and eventually alone in a small rented room. The money he once had was gone. The connections he once boasted about vanished. Nobody wanted to help a man whose story had become a warning. He tried reaching his father again. Letters, messages, calls. Each attempt went unanswered. The silence that used to frustrate him now terrified him, because silence meant the door was closed forever. At night, he would lie awake and remember every word he had spoken in anger. The slap, the insults, the cruelty. All of it replayed in the dark, like a film he couldn't turn off. He would whisper apologies to the air, hoping somehow they would reach the man he had wronged. But the air never answered back. Meanwhile, far away, the father lived quietly in a new town. The sea wasn't far from his small house, and the sound of waves filled the evenings with calm. He didn't check the news. He didn't ask about the house or the son. He had left all of that behind, not out of hate, but out of self-preservation. He spent his days tending to a small garden, reading old books, and walking along the shore. Each step on the sand reminded him of something simple, that peace grows best in silence. Sometimes, when the sun set, he would sit on his porch and close his eyes, remembering his wife, the early years of fatherhood, the laughter that once filled his home. He didn't regret raising his son, only trusting that kindness would always be enough. Back in the city, the son began working odd jobs. Pride had no place now, only survival. He earned enough to eat, to sleep, to exist. But every meal he bought, every bite he took, carried a bitter taste. He couldn't forget that night, his father's eyes when he looked up after being humiliated, the quiet pain that didn't shout but spoke louder than any scream. He had seen that same look in his own reflection now, hollow, defeated, ashamed. The punishment wasn't poverty, it was understanding. One day, months later, he returned to the old neighborhood. He stood across the street from the house that was once his. The new family had repainted the walls, replaced the furniture, planted flowers in the front yard. It looked alive again, brighter than before, but not for him. He stood there quietly, his eyes moist, his chest heavy. For a moment, he thought about walking up, knocking on the door, asking if they knew where his father went. But he didn't. Some doors, once closed, aren't meant to be reopened. He turned away and walked down the road, his footsteps slow, the air thick with memories. Later that night, as he sat alone in his rented room, he pulled out that same photograph again, the one of him as a baby in his father's arms. He placed it on the small table beside his bed. Then he spoke softly to it, not to the paper, but to the memory behind it. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I understand now." The next morning, he went to the bank. The teller handed him a letter that had been forwarded through legal channels, from his father's lawyer. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was a single page. No threats, no anger, just one final message. "You took what I earned. I took what I gave. Now we are equal. Learn from the silence, my son. It speaks louder than I ever could." He folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the photo. His tears came slowly this time, not from pain, but from the kind of acceptance that comes when denial finally dies. From that day on, he changed. He began volunteering at a local home for the elderly, serving food, cleaning, listening. He found small pieces of redemption in helping those who reminded him of the man he had lost. Every old face he saw carried a reflection of his father's wisdom, his patience, his quiet strength. It didn't erase his past, but it gave his future purpose. And somewhere, in another town, the father continued to live peacefully, unaware of how deeply his silence had transformed the man who once humiliated him. He didn't need to know. The lesson had already been learned, because revenge isn't always about seeing someone suffer. Sometimes it's about walking away and letting time do what anger never can: teach, humble, heal. Years later, when people in the neighborhood whispered about the story, the father, the son, the house, the downfall, they didn't speak with mockery. They spoke with quiet respect. It had become a legend, a reminder that love should never be mistaken for weakness. And so, the house changed owners, the son changed, and the father lived out his final days in peace. The world moved on, but the story remained, a testament that betrayal always finds its way home, and silence always delivers the strongest justice. Because the man who once spat in his father's food now ate humility every day, not as punishment, but as memory. And the father, who once sat in shame at the table, now ate in peace, knowing that he didn't destroy. He simply walked away and let the truth do the rest. The train ride was quiet, long, and strangely comforting. The old man sat by the window, watching the landscape roll past like pages turning in a forgotten book. The noise of the tracks was steady, almost like a heartbeat. He held a small cloth bag on his lap, the only things he had carried with him. A few clothes, some savings, and an old photograph of a smiling boy who once called him father, with love instead of contempt. He wasn't escaping. He was simply leaving behind what no longer needed his presence. As the train curved through the countryside, sunlight began to pour through the window, soft and golden. It brushed against his face like an old friend, reminding him of simpler times. There was peace in the air, a kind of quiet that city walls could never hold. He closed his eyes and breathed in deeply. For the first time in years, his chest didn't feel tight. The anger, the humiliation, the noise of betrayal, all of it was behind him now, swallowed by the rhythm of the rails. When he arrived at a small coastal town, the air smelled different, cleaner, fresher, tinged with salt. The station was small, barely busy, and the people who walked past smiled with simple curiosity. No one knew him here, no one whispered his name. That anonymity was his freedom. He stepped off the platform, feeling the ground beneath his feet as if touching the world anew. The sun was just beginning to rise over the water, painting the horizon in orange and blue. It felt like a sign, a quiet promise that life wasn't done with him yet. He found a modest place to stay, a small room above a bakery run by an old couple. The walls smelled faintly of bread and cinnamon. The rent was affordable, the people kind, and the ocean could be heard from the open window. It wasn't much, but it was enough. After years of noise, disrespect, and emotional suffocation, he didn't need much, only space to breathe, time to think, and peace that couldn't be bought. The couple who owned the bakery quickly took a liking to him. They didn't ask questions about his past, only offered kindness. Every morning, they would hand him a cup of tea and a piece of warm bread. He would thank them with a small bow and sit by the window, watching people start their day. Children laughed on their way to school. Fishermen prepared their boats, and the market began to fill with life. It was a world untouched by his pain, and that made it perfect. He soon developed a routine. He would wake up before dawn, walk to the beach with his cane, and watch the sunrise. The sky, with its changing colors, became his clock and companion. Sometimes he would sit for hours, letting the wind push against his skin, reminding him that he was still alive. He started sketching again, something he hadn't done in decades. His drawings were simple: waves, boats, seagulls, an occasional flower. But each line carried peace instead of pain. He never spoke of his past to anyone. When asked about family, he would only say, "They live far away." The truth was, he didn't need to explain. People who have known deep sorrow often recognize it in silence and respect it. In the afternoons, he helped at the bakery. He would sweep the floor, carry trays, and sometimes help count change. The couple paid him little, but he didn't mind. The real payment was human warmth, something he hadn't felt in years. In the evenings, the couple would insist he join them for dinner. He would sit at their small table, listening to their laughter, their simple stories about the town, and feel quietly grateful. Every night, after the dishes were done, he would return to his room, open the window, and listen to the sea. The sound of waves became his lullaby. It was constant, steady, forgiving. Unlike people, the sea didn't judge. It simply accepted everything that came to it and carried it away. He often thought about his son during these quiet hours. Not with anger, not with hate, but with the kind of sadness that softens over time. He wondered sometimes if the boy was eating well, if he had found work, if he regretted what he'd done. But he never tried to find out. The past was closed. Forgiveness didn't need reunion. It only needed peace. Weeks turned into months. The old man became part of the town's rhythm. Children would wave to him when he passed by. The locals called him Grandpa, even though no one knew his real name. He began tending a small garden behind the bakery, planting flowers, herbs, and a few vegetables. The smell of earth on his hands reminded him of youth, of effort that built something real. Every time a seed sprouted, it felt like a small act of rebirth. One morning, while watering the plants, he found a small stray dog sleeping under a tree. It was thin, dirty, and trembling. He approached slowly, setting down a bowl of water beside it. The dog lifted its head, hesitant at first, then began to drink. From that day on, it stayed. He named it Shadow because it followed him everywhere, to the beach, the market, the garden. They became quiet companions, bound not by words, but by shared loneliness, healed by time. The townspeople began to notice his gentleness. He had a way of smiling at others without speaking, a calm presence that seemed to settle storms. People came to him for advice, not because he preached, but because he listened. And in listening, they found comfort. Years passed. The seasons changed. His hair turned whiter, his back bent further, but his eyes, those eyes that once carried humiliation, now held something brighter. Peace had taken the place of pain. Occasionally, he would sit by the window with a notebook and write small reflections, thoughts about life, kindness, mistakes, and forgiveness. He didn't plan to publish them. They were simply conversations with himself. In one entry, he wrote, "Revenge is loud, but peace whispers longer. My son took my respect once, but I took back my soul by walking away." That became his truth. One day, a young traveler arrived in town. He came to the bakery often, always asking about the old man who helped there. Over time, they became friends. The traveler was curious about his past, but the old man never revealed everything. He simply said, "Life teaches in strange ways. Mine taught me through silence." Before leaving, the traveler gifted him a journal saying, "Write your story someday. Someone might need it." The old man smiled. He didn't know if anyone would ever read it, but he began writing again, not for revenge, not for pity, but for those who might someday face betrayal and forget that peace is still possible. In his final years, he no longer thought of wealth, status, or the house he had left behind. He realized that everything material could vanish, but dignity, once reclaimed, never fades. He continued walking by the sea every morning. The horizon reminded him that endings are just new beginnings drawn in softer colors. He would sometimes stop, close his eyes, and whisper a quiet blessing for his son, not to erase what happened, but to wish him wisdom. The townspeople noticed when his steps grew slower, his voice quieter. One evening, they found him sitting by the shore, his cane beside him, a faint smile on his face. The tide had come in gently, touching his feet, as if saying farewell. He was gone, peacefully, silently, like the waves he loved. When they searched his room, they found only a few possessions: the photograph of a young boy, the journal he had written in, and a folded note resting on the desk. It said, "To whoever finds this, if life breaks you, let it teach you, not end you. Walk away when love turns cruel. Silence is not weakness, it's wisdom finding its voice. The bakery couple buried him near the sea, under a tree that bloomed white every spring. The town attended the small funeral, their eyes heavy but hearts light. They spoke of him as a man who carried peace like a candle through the dark, and far away, in another city, a man, older now, humbled by time, opened a letter that had been sent months before. It was addressed in handwriting he knew well. He opened it slowly, hands trembling. Inside was a single line: "Dogs eat from the floor only when people forget to feed love." Tears blurred his eyes. He folded the paper and placed it beside the same old photograph he still kept by his bed. That night, he whispered to the empty room, "I remember, Father. I finally remember." And though distance had kept them apart, silence had done its work, not to destroy, but to heal. Because sometimes the most powerful ending is not revenge, but peace that needs no witness. Years passed like quiet waves, one fading softly into the next. The world changed around him, but the story remained the same, etched not on paper, but on the hearts of those who heard it. The old man's tale became something of a whisper in the town, a story told in bakeries and by the sea, not for drama, but for wisdom. He had left behind no enemies, no debts, no noise, only the weight of truth and the lightness of peace. He had lived enough to understand that time is not an enemy. It is a mirror. It shows what you carry inside, whether regret or grace. His reflection in that mirror had changed. Where once he saw sorrow, now he saw understanding. He knew now that not every heartbreak demands confrontation. Some demand distance. Walking away, he realized, is not surrender. It is self-respect in its quietest form. When people asked about his past, he didn't tell them everything. He would simply smile and say, "Life taught me to speak less and feel more." He didn't want sympathy. He wanted awareness, for those younger than him to see what silence, cruelty, and pride can destroy. Because when respect dies, family follows. He had learned that the hard way, through the sting of betrayal and the stillness that came after. On quiet evenings, he would sit by the sea, his loyal companion, shadow, beside him, and talk to the horizon. The setting sun painted the waves gold, and the air carried the smell of salt and memory. He would think of his wife, gone years ago, and whisper her name softly, as if the wind could still deliver it to her. He wondered if she would be proud of him, for not letting anger consume him, for choosing silence over revenge. In his heart, he believed she would. The sea always reminded him of forgiveness, endless, deep, and indifferent. It accepts everything that falls into it, storms, rain, tears, and still remains vast. He wanted to be like that, not untouched, but unbroken. He thought often of his son, not as an enemy, but as a part of himself, the part that had lost its way. Some nights, he would close his eyes and imagine him as a child again, laughing, running through the garden, holding his hand with tiny fingers. Those memories still hurt, but they didn't poison him anymore. Pain, when left alone, eventually transforms into clarity. He realized that the son he once knew had been replaced by pride long before that night of humiliation. The man who spat in his food was not the same boy who once cried for bedtime stories. Pride had hollowed him, blinded him, turned love into ownership. And though the father had every reason to curse him, he never did. Because to curse him would mean carrying the same poison he had walked away from. He found strength in small things. The sound of rain on his window, the warmth of a stranger's smile, the quiet loyalty of his dog. Life, he discovered, does not end after betrayal. It begins again, smaller, slower, softer, but purer. Sometimes he would write in his journal, the one the traveler had given him. One entry read, "When someone disrespects you, it is not your job to shout. It is your job to remember who you are. I was a father before I was humiliated, and I remained one after. His hands hurt me, but they could not touch my peace." Another page said, "You can forgive a mistake, but when someone turns your love into a weapon, the best forgiveness is distance." These words became his anchor. They reminded him that dignity is not a gift from others. It is a responsibility to oneself. As the years went by, his health began to fade. His hands trembled slightly when he held his teacup. His steps grew slower, and the once black cane had worn smooth under his palm. But his mind, his clarity, remained sharp. People came to him often, seeking advice. Young couples who fought over pride, children who disrespected their parents, and even strangers who carried secrets they couldn't share elsewhere. He listened to them all, never judging. He would wait for them to finish, then say something simple like, "You cannot build peace on the ruins of ego." It wasn't poetic, it was experience distilled into truth. In time, his story reached beyond the town. Visitors came, curious about the old man who lived by the sea, the one who forgave betrayal without bitterness. Some came expecting drama, but left with reflection. His life became a quiet sermon, not of religion, but of humanity. He never once saw his son again, though sometimes he sensed his presence in the wind, as if time itself carried apologies that words never could. He didn't need to hear them aloud. Some apologies, he believed, arrived too late for the ears, but right on time for the soul. One late afternoon, as the sun set in fire and gold, he sat by the water, feeling his years in the weight of his breath. Shadow lay beside him, head resting on his foot. He smiled faintly, running his fingers through the soft fur. "We did well," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "We found peace." That night, he wrote his final entry. It was short, simple, and complete. If love turns cruel, walk away. If family turns poisonous, let them go. Forgive, not to heal them, but to free yourself, because peace is the only inheritance worth leaving behind. The next morning the sun rose as usual. Birds sang, the ocean moved, but the chair by the window was empty. The old man had gone quietly in his sleep, his face calm, his lips curved in a faint smile. The townspeople found him like that, peaceful, dignified, untouched by regret. They buried him beside the sea, under a tree that bloomed white in spring. The townsfolk placed his cane beside the grave and his journal on top of it. The pages fluttered in the breeze, carrying words into the world, the same world that once wounded him but later healed him. Months later, the story reached his son. He read it through trembling fingers, each word cutting deeper than any slap ever could. He learned that his father had lived well, loved quietly, and died at peace. The man he had called weak had in truth been the strongest of them both. The son visited the sea once, years later. He stood before the grave, tears soaking the soil. No one recognized him. He didn't want them to. He didn't speak, didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply bowed his head and stayed until the tide touched his shoes. When he left, the wind carried something unseen, maybe a whisper, maybe a blessing. The sea kept its rhythm, the town kept its stories, and peace, that silent, stubborn peace, remained. The old man's name faded with time, but his lesson didn't. It lived in every person who heard his story and remembered to treat kindness as sacred. His silence had become a voice, stronger than words, echoing through generations. Because in the end, revenge fades, anger burns out, but dignity lives forever. He had proved that justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks away, barefoot, unshaken, and eternal. And so, the story closes where it began, not with shouting, not with pain, but with stillness. A father once humiliated for his hunger died full, not of food, but of peace. A son once rich with pride was left starving, not of money, but of meaning. And the world kept turning, carrying the truth forward in quiet repetition. He said dogs eat from the floor. The next day, he learned how it feels. But the father, he walked away, and in that silence, he became untouchable.